Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Warren Binford, and I have the pleasure of opening the fifth event that we have today as part of our track on 21st century child abuse, the impact of digital technologies. This fifth panel is focused on the prevention and treatment of child sexual abuse and exploitation, and it's being moderated by Dr. Steve Berkowitz. Steve is one of our nation's leading child psychiatrists. He serves as the director of the Stress, Trauma, Adversity Research and Treatment Center at CU Anschutz, and he's a widely recognized expert on both hands-on and hands-off child sexual abuse. We're so grateful to have him moderate this panel and to have him as a colleague here at the Kempe Center. So, Steve?
Oh, thank you, Warren. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So I'm just going to give brief introductions about each of our panel members and let them introduce themselves in more detail because they'll do a better job than I will. We are presenting and using PowerPoints, but please feel free to ask any questions via chat or verbally if you'd like. I will moderate the chat, so I can, relay these questions more readily. But please, your own experiences, your thoughts, examples that seem to resonate with you are very welcome throughout. So our first presenter is Dr. Daniela Ligero. She's the CEO of Together for Girls and co-founder of the Brave Movement. And she's going to be talking about the importance of survivor voices and advocacy to end sexual violence against children. Our second presenter is Dr. Carrie-Ann Wash. She's a professor at Queensland University of Technology, School of Early Childhood and Exclusive Education. And she's going to talk about the WHO's What Works Prevention Report. And last, we have Dr. Lucy Berliner, who is the director of the Harvard Youth Center for Sexual Assault and Traumatic Stress. She's a clinical associate professor at the University of Washington School of Social Work. So I'm very excited about this international perspective, and I hope we all learn a lot together. And again, feel free to add questions in the chat at any time. All right. So, Daniela, off with you.
All right, here we go. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and congratulations on a great conference and all the work that's being discussed over the last few days. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you, Ernie, for reaching out and inviting me to speak here. As Stephen mentioned, I am the CEO of Together for Girls. We are a global partnership working to end violence against children and adolescents, working in over 24 countries around the world. And we believe in a simple model to drive action, and that is that data, when paired with advocacy, can lead to action. And I'll say from my own perspective as a researcher and a psychologist in a previous life, that I really believe that it is essential for us to have good research, good data, evidence, and I've spent a lot of time building that as part of Together for Girls. In fact, one of the things we do is these national household surveys with CDC and national governments to look at population level data on violence against children, including sexual violence, exploitation, and abuse. And we now have data for 20% of the world's population living in low-income countries. Is the single largest data source on the issue globally. And I'm going to be talking about advocacy today because we also believe that data is essential but not sufficient. And we believe that you also have to pair that with powerful advocacy to create the kind of change we want to see. And as Stephen mentioned, I'm going to be talking about survivor-centered and survivor-led advocacy. We've really been inspired by so many other movements where people with lived experience have come forward, like in HIV and, road traffic, et cetera, safety, and have created and demanded the kinds of change that they wanted to see. And at this point, I will share with you all that in addition to all the things I'm also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I was sexually abused by someone close to my family, starting at the age of 6. And I always say I'm one of the few fortunate ones because I eventually was able to tell my parents, and I got a lot of support and services that, I'm 48 today. So it's been a long journey to get me here today. One that most children don't have. And so I know as a survivor that it's important that not everyone is in a place where they want to share their story, where they can share their story, where they should. So I just want to be clear when I present some slides, I am in no way, shape, or form saying everyone that's a survivor needs to come forward. We are building a movement of survivors and allies. Everyone is welcome. And we also know that there are a lot of people like me out there who are survivors who are telling their stories. I've been public for almost 15 years now. Frankly, I was at the Department of State working under the Obama administration at the time, and we were working on a gender-based violence strategy and having zero conversations with survivors. And I just thought, oh my gosh, I can't keep doing this. So I decided to come forward. So we're really mindful of all the ethical issues and all the things that we know are important. And there are people out there who are telling their stories. And if we come together, we can be impactful in demanding the kind of change that we want to see for generations to come. So I'm going to tell you about the BRAVE movement briefly. We always say we are brave so that children can be safe. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I've been up to. In these slides, I'll be just quick. And hopefully you can see them. Let's give it a second to load. Can you see this? It doesn't look like it's the full screen, right? Oh, it was working a second ago. Hold on. One more try, and then if not, I'll just do something else. Okay, present. Should be coming. Do you see a screen? Yes, good. The BRAVE movement to end childhood sexual violence. We are a global expanding movement of survivors, but also allies from around the world. We launched about 18 months ago. And I will say it has been phenomenal to see what has happened with this. It's kind of this idea whose time has come in terms of the rapid growth, and we're just trying to catch up. And we're different. We're different from some of the other ways in which survivors have been engaged in advocacy. And we really are survivor-led, survivor-centered. I'll say a little bit more about this. We're activists. We're not ashamed to talk about that. We're out in the streets demanding the kinds of change we want to see. And we're a space for survivors and activists as well as allies to strategize. The picture here was an activation that we led in Brussels 2 weeks ago, where the EU is considering legislation to make the internet safer for kids. And we had survivors from across Europe as well as allies come out and support that legislation. We have 3 pillars that are central to all the advocacy we do. Again, this is an advocacy movement: prevention, which I know we're talking about here today, but we also talk about healing and justice. And we changed our framework a little bit because we heard from survivors that this is important to them more than treatment, more than response. Survivors want prevention, healing, and justice, and these 3 pillars are interconnected. We're global and rapidly growing, and we have what we're calling BRAVE platforms at regional and national level, where organizations and individuals are beginning to organize to figure out what do they want to see change in their countries or at regional level. We have some pretty dynamic BRAVE platforms. I'm going to try to show you this.
Currently, I'm using around $200 for one girl a month for therapy, food, clothing, for education equipment.
I'm taking a degree in criminology because I never got justice. I don't want any other girl to go through the same thing I went through.
That's just a sense of, we have at this point just in Kenya over 60 organizations that have come together to declare themselves brave in Kenya, sorry. We're building the play as we're flying it. It's all happening quickly and it's kind of exciting, but also we want to make sure that we're considering all the things that we know are important in terms of self-care, ethics, support. So we're doing our best as we continue forward. This is our advisory group. It's our board. These are 14 survivor leaders, myself included, from around the world. All of us are open about being survivors. All of us have been doing advocacy and work for a very long time, and we represent every region of the world, as well as multiple forms of sexual violence in the church, online, in schools, in the family, in communities. We also have a team of individuals that's supporting the work, who are specialists in various areas, especially communications and advocacy. And we've decided on a global goal for our movement. Some people were talking before about this, but the idea is that a global goal, in addition to national priorities, builds energy, momentum, creates synergy, and builds global impact. And we've decided that the safer internet is going to be our goal for 23 and 24. There are many political opportunities that are presenting themselves. I'm happy to say more about this later. We've also done quite a lot of work on statutes of limitation with, some of you know, Marcy Hamilton, who's now Child Global, working with us. And we've done a significant piece of work in Europe, around SOLs in Europe, and now moving to Latin America. We've also had opportunities to meet with decision makers. It turns out a lot of decision makers want to meet directly with survivors. This is Sarah Dines, the safeguarding minister in the UK, meeting with individuals from Brave UK. And we're different because we're also recognizing survivor expertise. Those of us who are engaged are lawyers, are journalists, are psychologists, we have a lot of expertise, and we're not there just to tell our sad stories. We can make people cry quickly. We're there to influence policy, to be part of the solution and the decision-making. These are just some examples in practice. And we've been able to get quite a lot in terms of the media profile to raise visibility around this issue. We're moving in Africa, we're moving in Europe. There's a lot more I can say, but I really want to stick to my time. So I'll stop there and say thank you, and over to you, Steve. You're on mute.
First error of being a moderator. Well, thank you. I'm wondering if there are any questions, and certainly can ask. So I'll start. I'm actually curious about how you put this all together. It's not an easy task to do this internationally or even locally. So I'm very curious about the dirty nuts and bolts details.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So I've been working in international development for 25 years and on these issues. And so one of the things that's happened is when you start telling your story, other people who are survivors find you. And they say, I'm a survivor, I'm working in this place. So over the years, I've kind of been meeting these amazing leaders all over the world. And I was like, what are we going to do together? And then I did spend 3 years planning, strategizing, and trying to get funding for this. And I'm very excited that last year, the Oak Foundation gave us a significant grant for $10 million. It's called a Big Bet grant to get this going and get it off the ground. So it was a lot of energy, time, and thinking before we were able to get to this point.
All right, so the first rule is have enough money.
So first have a good strategy and then go find the money.
Okay, fair enough. So what was the strategy? I guess that's what I was asking.
There's so much work that went into that with consultants who studied other movements, looking at campaigning and advocacy, at what works, what doesn't in other movements. We have a very detailed kind of, strategy around this, but overall, the top line is, one is elevate and support survivor leadership and voices. So who are those survivors? How do you support them and give them visibility? And the second is coordinated campaigning. So bringing people together around the goal to make noise with people who really know how to do advocacy and campaigning, experts in the field, to really break through.
Any other thoughts or questions from folks? I hate an empty space. All right. All right, next up, we have Dr. Carrie-Ann Wash.
Thank you very much, Steve. And hi, everyone. I'm presenting today from Brisbane in Australia. I work at Queensland University of Technology. And like Daniela, I'm so grateful that Ernie and Warren and others reached out to ask me to present. So I'm going to present some work that I completed with David Finkelhor, Lisa Jones, Samantha Sutton, Eugenia Opuda, and Sabine Rakata-Lamalala from the WHO. And I'm going to just share my screen so that I can show you. Okay, so you should see a PowerPoint presentation there. Great. So this was a report that was commissioned to us via the WHO, End Violence and Safe Online. And we trawled, what we did was we trawled the scientific literature to try and work out where the largest body of evidence for prevention of online violence against children lived or existed. Where does it exist? In what fields? So our review had three big components. One was a best practice review on youth-focused prevention, so broadly outside of the online violence area. The second was a rapid review of online safety programs for children and youth. And the third was a desk review of any online safety programs that we could lay our hands on via our desk, accessing them via our desks and via our screens, and looking inside those programs for what they had to offer. When we conceptualized online violence against children, of course, you have to kind of draw the boundaries around what you're looking at, what your phenomenon is. So we conceptualized it in this way, congruent with how the WHO were thinking about it. We conceptualized online sexual abuse, sexual exploitation and abuse as things like grooming, live streaming, sexual abuse images, and non-consensual sharing of sexual images, sometimes, but not by us, referred to as revenge porn or sextortion. And the other dimension was the kind of non-sexual cyber aggression, including cyberbullying, cyber stalking, and hacking and identity theft, because children and youth are subject to that just as we are as adults. We looked across a whole range of literature. So to come to the conclusions that we did about what's effective. And we found that the strongest evidence exists in the field of education for programs for youth and families. These programs, over a long history of time, not just in the online space, but in general prevention, have been effective with a wide range of youth risks. They're effective with multiple forms of violence against children, not only online violence against children, and increasingly demonstrated as effective, very effective with cyberbullying. So why the literature pointed to education programs was because the literature seems to have focused on education programs more than others. And there's lots of reasons why that might happen. Schools and education facilities are great venues for trying to prevent any kind of social or health issue. And over many, many decades, schools have been the venue for those prevention efforts, or one of the venues for those prevention efforts. But we don't rule out that effective prevention may happen in other areas. It's just that the research evidence, the scientific evidence for that, the bulk of it is not there. And it may get there eventually, and we hope that it does. But at the moment, the bulk of evidence exists in educational programs for youth and families. We were looking for the types of evidence where there were multiple evaluation studies that had been done, and where those evaluation studies were very rigorous. So they'd been done, for example, with a class or a school or multiple schools of children, but their results had been compared to children who had not received an intervention or had not received a program. And we also looked for fields of prevention evidence where there were multiple evaluations that had occurred over time, and there were other studies that had drawn all of that literature together, all of that evidence together, and done what they call a meta-analysis, a systematic review and a meta-analysis of that. And we were also looking at program evidence where there was demonstrated evidence of behavioural change. So the outcomes of those programs were not only changes in knowledge, skills and attitudes or self-efficacy, even though those things are really important. We were also looking for where there had been behavioural change. And that's why most of the evidence was kind of condensed or collected in the education space. Some of the issues with the literature in that area, or the evidence in that area, are that most has been conducted in high-income countries, in regions like North America and Europe. So that's got limitations when we consider applying it in other regions that might have different contextual background features. And when we do these kinds of reviews, it's essentially backwards looking. So we're looking backwards over a long period of time. We can't predict the future in these kinds of reviews. And I feel like a field like online violence against children is a rapidly moving one. So in a nutshell, what we found that works are cyberbullying prevention. It really works. There are some excellent, highly evaluated, rigorously evaluated programs that are available. If I was a school principal, I would be doing an evaluated, established cyberbullying program, or bullying and cyberbullying program in my school. What works is also the use of multiple and varied teaching strategies and learning tools. So what we mean by that is that a 1 hour kind of talking at kids in a lecture hall or in the assembly hall isn't going to work as well as something that has been done over an entire semester or an entire year, and involves, lessons that are taught in their classrooms by highly skilled presenters that engage kids in discussion, in role plays, in demonstrations, in actually making things and doing things, and probably even in some advocacy. What works is repeated exposure and gradually a greater intensity. So the longer a program is, typically it's going to work better. That's the case with anything educational. And it works when we teach skills. And I'll point out in a moment in another slide what those specific skills are. And of course, the whole school environment needs to be involved in these kinds of efforts for them to work. They need to involve teacher training. They need to involve engagement with parents. They need to involve every child at every year level in every class, doing this throughout the school year. The skills that, when we dived inside the program evaluations and looked inside the programs, we found that by far the most highly effective, the skills with the greatest amount of change over in prevention programs are things like problem-solving skills and assertiveness. So over 70% of programs include those kind of problem-solving and assertiveness components. Effective programs do. And that kind of assertiveness applies to, relates to things like their self-efficacy. So how capable they feel to do certain things in a certain context. Skills like disengagement, so how to get out of tricky situations online, is really important. Empathy, perspective taking, and appreciation of things like difference are important skills. Emotion regulation, being able to self-regulate and disengage again from, and how that's related to disengagement, being able to stop and disengage from situations that are really challenging or harmful online. Conflict resolution skills, help-seeking skills, and things like bystander or upstander mobilization. So those are skills that are really important for a program to be effective. They need to contain the teaching of those skills. So we think that some next steps in terms of the whole ecosystem of programs, educational programs that are out there, we think that any program could improve by building on some of the evidence-based models that we have found. So modeling their program on a program that has been shown to be effective over a long period of time and contain those elements that I just spoke about. It would help if programs could be uplifted and could contain those different components that are shown to work. So enhancing programs so that they align more with what works, enhancing their contents, but also the way in which the messages are delivered to children and youth would really help. There should be less focus on stranger danger in these programs, because children can be groomed, exploited, and abused by friends and acquaintances. And the evidence on the prevalence of different forms of online violence against children are showing that it's perpetrated not only by strangers or by adults, but also by friends and peers. And we think that programs that can move to becoming more comprehensive and more integrated by avoiding single topic programs, the siloing that occurs. So schools have a lot on their plates. They teach sexual abuse prevention, they teach cyberbullying, they teach social emotional learning, they teach online safety, they teach digital citizenship programs. If we could start to avoid that siloing of single topic programs and begin to look across those programs at what their common elements are, we might then begin to have programs that are capable of addressing all forms of violence against children, including online violence against children. And where programs do not have content, where they do address violence against children, but don't have content in online violence against children, they should add those components to their programs. So that's a fast and furious tour through our WHO report. The link to the report is on the front slide and also here. Thank you.
Went off mute. I'm very proud of myself. So questions, thoughts for Carrie Ann or Daniela for that matter? All right, my turn again. So Carrie Ann, I was curious about clearly the data was mostly, Western oriented, wealthier countries. What do we know about, the undeveloped or underdeveloped part of the world, and what works or what's being tried?
Yeah, it's a good question, Steve. So we are beginning to know more about prevalence. So taking a public health approach, we need to know about prevalence as a kind of foundation stone to what we do. And we're beginning to know more about prevalence via some excellent studies that have been funded by End Violence and Safe Online and a whole other, you know, array of a coalition of partners internationally. And those reports are called Disrupting Harm reports. They've been conducted so far in, I think, 14 different African, South American and East Asian countries. And they're beginning to show some of the differences in the types of prevalence and the types of online violence that children in those different countries experience. So just one example that stands out to me is that there's quite a difference in the Philippines, for example, in the amount of online violence against children that is contributed to by children's parents, as opposed to in other countries where it might be you know, exploitation is happening by peers and other adults, or even sometimes by strangers, by cartels in different countries. So even though the internet is global, there are some kind of regional nuances that are starting to emerge. In the MENA countries, the Middle East and North African countries, we know from other work outside disrupting violence that cyberbullying is a huge factor there, and some of that cyberbullying can be related to faith. So that's a particular nuance about what happens in those countries. Now, prevention education programs exist in virtually every country throughout the world, but what we don't have evidence of is, and we've looked inside some of those programs because some of them are publicly available online, but what we don't have are high quality evaluation studies of those programs to be able to inform us about, you know, what is it that those programs contain that actually makes the difference or is actually working, and if they are actually working. So we have to look at a program in terms of what it contains, so its content and methods, or in education speak, we'll call that its curriculum and pedagogy, so contents and methods. So we have to look at what's inside the program, and then we have to look at what its effects are. So does it create behavioral change in the domains that we want to see? And what are the underlying drivers of behavior change? So is it knowledge? Is it attitudes? Is it skill development? And so on. So programs work in different ways. Logic models are really crucial to that. Understanding, so being able to map out how we think the program works to be able to design a really good evaluation. But yeah, we strongly encourage program developers, program implementers to work alongside researchers to be able to evaluate programs. Some of in Western countries, it's actually quite a resource-intensive process, but in some low and middle income countries, because there's such goodwill with research and with you know, the kids actually being able to join in and complete evaluations, you know, participate in evaluation studies. It would be great to see more programs partnering with universities in those countries to be able to deliver high quality evaluations. It's not really hard to deliver a high quality evaluation. There's really good guidelines available for how we do that. And those of us who are more experienced in that are always happy to lend a hand in providing advice on how to do that. There, I've kind of given a very long answer to that, Stephen. But yeah, there are programs out there. They just don't have you know, really strong, rigorous evaluations and multiple evaluations of them over time. So we can't just evaluate a program once. We need to keep it going over time because things change.
I have one other question. What about other programs other than for cyberbullying?
Yeah, so there are programs, they're less well evaluated. So the cyberbullying and cyberbullying programs, so the cyberbullying programs have had the advantage of being able to build on 40 years of physical bullying prevention, and they've been able to draw across a lot of the principles and practices across into cyberbullying, and that seems to have worked. And that's a big signal should be a big signal to program developers that kind of non-hands-on or hands-on, you know, or contact, physical types of problems. Some of the strategies there can be drawn across into preventing online child exploitation and abuse. Sorry, what was the question again, Steve? I just lost
about
my train of thought. I'm
other,
not fully caffeinated yet.
yeah, it's early for you. No, other, programs and evaluations related to, online exploitation, sex
Oh, yeah.
abuse.
Yeah. So there are some programs that do the kind of more siloed approach, like looking at just sexting, for example. And there have been 1 or 2 evaluations on sexting prevention programs. And this is a really good example, actually, because there are a lot of different schools of thought about how we might tackle the sexting. And one approach is you scare kids to death and, fear-mongering kind of approaches. And based on what we know about the literature, the evidence more broadly, that is not going to work, because it's a thing that kids see as being something they want to engage in. So a harm prevention, harm minimization approach is likely to work better, but we don't have a lot of programs that have evaluated themselves to that extent. And I would be wary also of a program that only looks at that one domain, because sexting is related to a whole lot of other things that happen online. So it's very difficult to just separate that out and teach only a sexting prevention program, if we wanted to call it that, although I don't think programs actually call themselves that. There are other broader programs like digital citizenship or critical media literacy programs that are out there. They teach kids the basic skills about how to keep your information private and consider your digital footprint and who might find out things about you in the future if things about you online are publicly available. But those things are quite a light touch on some of the more risky things that kids engage in. So that's good kind of foundation. Again, a good foundation stone. Digital citizenship is something that should run through all schools at all levels and can be integrated into virtually every subject area that we teach. But the kind of more pointy end, the more risky kinds of behaviors, those programs tend to be a light touch on those and don't want to dive into them. I believe there's a place for experts, for specialist providers of these kinds of programs that go into schools, like sex education. I don't think all teachers are well equipped or necessarily want to become capable or are capable of becoming capable of teaching about the high-end risks. And I don't think we should expect them to. So I think there's a great space for high quality adjunct providers of these programs in schools, and they exist. Good models for that exist in terms of comprehensive sex education.
Well, I guess that's where we're at right now. Well, let's do this. We do have some time, so let's go with Dr. Berliner, Lucy, and maybe we can have some discussion after she's done. Lucy, you're up. Now get off mute and go. You're still muted.
I'm
There you
Lucy
go.
Berliner, and au contraire to Steve's introduction, I'm actually a social worker, proudly so. I'm not a doctor, but I appreciate that people are so often wanting to grant me a honorary doctoral degree. I recently retired from and my entire career spent in a specialty clinic at a university medical center providing medical and counseling services first starting in the 70s to sexual assault victims, children and adults, and then we expanded into trauma victims and survivors of other types of trauma in the last 20, 25 years. But sexual assault victims have always been our primary patient population. So I've been a clinician, but primarily it's where my heart has always been, but I've been involved in a lot of other things related to sexual assault. I want to just, oh, and by the way, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have a handout. It's got my contact info and every point I'm going to make and the key articles I'm going to mention. That's like a habit I have to highlight articles that I think are especially important in helping us forward in thinking about understanding impact and treatment. So I'm going to use the term sexual assault, not sexual abuse, because I want to capture the whole broad variation of sexual victimization experiences that people can have. And I also start from a framework that is in that sexual assault is always wrong and always causes harm. Now, when I think about harm, I don't think developing a psychological disorder harm. That's one kind of harm. But these experiences change people in many different ways. And I think what worries me sometimes is that we focus so much on how ruined or harmed or wounded people are that we forget that we don't need to encourage harmness in order to recognize people have been affected. So being affected is always going to be the case. And I think I'm just going to jump in following on Daniela. I'm a survivor too. My childhood experiences were really, I think, more the usual gropings, rubbings, exposings that most women experience. But as an adult, when long after I was in my job, I had a threat-related sexual assault experience. What we found out later was a convicted rapist came in my house at night and sexually terrorized me. Now he never touched me, and it lasted 15, 20 minutes. I never got PTSD or any other psychological disorder, but my life was changed. And I would say permanently. I live in a building, not in a house. I haven't stayed by myself in a house in 30 years. I have heightened alert walking home at night. I wouldn't do it at dark. So I just want to make a reminder of the breadth of harm, even though I'm going to go now into more the psychological harm, that's not all there is. And all victims and survivors should get equivalent validation and acknowledgement. We don't want to be ranking seriousness is not a good thing. So broad scope sexual assault, let's keep in mind, it's not just little kids being abused in the family. Probably the biggest group of victims that is often overlooked when we use the term. So I have a very specific reason for using the term sexual assault or sexual victimization. One of the biggest groups we don't think of are teenage rape victims. And that's the largest percentage of victims in adolescence. And their experiences look almost identical to the experience of young adults. It's one-off, peers, acquaintances, often in social context. And that's a form of youth victimization. In fact, all of sexual victimization broadly is mostly against children and young women. So that, and within that are not only the rape victims, the teen rape victims and the child sexual abuse victims, but there are a whole broad range of other types of sexual victimizations. Like there are rapes and kidnappings, rare as they might be, but they do happen. There are also on the others, another variation, which is compliant victims, victims who have been persuaded that they're not victims, that they're in love with their perpetrators. They're trafficked kids. There is online victimization. There's image-based victimization. So recognize a lot of different things, and why that is especially important when you're thinking treatment and intervention is we can't make assumptions about the nature of the experience without learning it from our individual patients or clients. And of course, we all know it's a pretty male perpetrator scenario, but I do want to highlight that a lot of offenders, sex offenders, are kids. Up to 40% in various studies are juveniles. So again, it's not just one thing, and that's really relevant when you think about interventions on the side of focusing on offenders. And I know there's been a lot of conversation, I'm sure the whole day has been a lot of conversation about online and image-based, which are more recent versions of sexual victimization. And I'm guessing we just heard from Carrie Ann about the work they're doing on prevention, but I know David Finkler was talking earlier, and his two recent papers kind of summarizing online victimization and image-based victimization are really a good reminder that the stereotypical version we have of an adult luring a kid or an adult making pictures of kids being abused, that turns out to be kind of a minority of cases. And with the image-based, most of the images are being made by the victims and then being misused by others. In the online, my head blew off just trying to follow David's graphs of the different kinds of things. So just a reminder that this is not a unitary problem. People aren't affected in a unitary way. And some things can be quite surprising. People can have the most horrendous experience you can imagine and never develop a psychological condition. And we don't want to say that means they weren't affected. So moving over to the impact in the psychological area, because that's what I do, that's what I know the most about, and that's where we have the greatest opportunity when we're in the after the fact business. And I am in the after the fact business. And literally every patient I saw for 45 years was either a child or an adult affected by trauma. So I'm pretty deep into that as my pretty much most things I learned from victims and watching their journey and hopefully helping them on it. So there are a few things that have come up in recent years that I think are really important for us to recognize. First of all, in terms of long-term impact, I don't know if all of you have seen these recent papers coming out in the last couple of years show that have to do with outcomes and memory. They now have these studies where they have they've documented the early child abuse or adversities, and then they're following up many years later and asking the survivors about it. Well, some people don't even remember it. And many people remember it in different kinds of ways. And what they've found is it's the subjective experience and the memory and how it has affected their narrative or outlook on life. That's what leads to the psychological harm, not the factual nature of what happened. In fact, people who don't remember it don't really have elevated psychological harm, at least of the kind we measure. Now, I consider that to be an incredibly good piece of news. We can't change the past. We can't unwind the past. But what we can do is help people whose memories are intrusive, invasive, and disturbing. And what we can do is help people who have adopted a negative view of themselves or the world as a result of these experiences. So the fact that what happened is less important than how it's remembered is actually a very good thing to know. And I don't worry too much about exactly what happened because it isn't all that important. It's what we've got right here in front of us. And so I think these are interesting papers, and they're on my handout, so no need to worry about writing anything down. Now, another thing has to do with in this line of work of trauma, we have an official definition, and it's the one that appears in diagnostic schemes, which is a threat-related event. Now, I know in recent years, the word trauma has expanded to practically every upsetting and uncomfortable experience, but I am not talking about that. I'm talking about threat-related experiences. And the research I'm going to mention all is starting with that relatively specific and somewhat narrow definition. One important finding we have now, and again, these longitudinal prospective studies give us an insight that we can't get any other way, where kids have been followed from the get-go, they've assessed things all the way along the line, and then at some point they ask them, have you ever had a trauma or adversity experience? So one of the best studies, and it's from out of the UK, finds that kids who've been exposed to a trauma have elevated rates of every psychological condition, not just PTSD, which is trauma specific, but everything. That's anxiety, depression, disruptive behaviors, eating disorders, substance abuse. They have elevated levels of suicidality, self-harm, and violent behaviors. And when you get my handout, you'll see it's an almost impenetrable table. And I work really hard to simplify it. So the gist you will get is you can just see no trauma exposure, certain level of rates of problems, trauma exposure, it goes up just by being exposed. So it's really important for us to get away from conceptualizing trauma psychological impact as PTSD, because it's operating in the development of all psychological disorders. Now, sexual assault in particular, I think the evidence supports it. It's of all the traumas and bad things that can happen in a kid's life, it probably has the greatest amount of harm. And we could have a conversation about why we think that's true. But a study that came out of Australia, by the way, just this past year, the title tells it all. Childhood sexual abuse and pervasive problems across multiple life domains, findings from a 5-decade study. So they've been following these people for 50 years, I guess. And while the individual relationships between the sexual abuse and a particular clinical problem or other challenge in life are not really very big, when you look at the overall accumulation, it's pretty bad in terms of and it's across the spectrum. You know, they're not looking just at psychological health risk behaviors, inflammation, yes, you name it. So even if one by one, it doesn't matter. You look at a group of people sexually abused in childhood over the course of their lives, they are going to have a harder life. Now, I want to talk just a minute about PTSD, because we're in a moment with PTSD, and as you know, in most diagnoses, the cause is not incorporated into the diagnosis. But for PTSD, that makes it somewhat unusual. Steve, would you agree? Clinical person here. You cannot get PTSD without experiencing a qualifying traumatic stressor, which is a threat-related event. And so we have tons and tons of studies showing how the relationship between trauma and PTSD. And overall for kids, there's a really good study by Eva Alisic, who's fantastic, she's in Australia now, on the rates of PTSD among children affected by exposed to trauma. And it's about 16%. So overall, all kids exposed to any trauma, about 16% of them are going to get PTSD. So it's not the most common response. For girls with interpersonal violence, it jumps up to about a third. And I'm guessing those girls are sexual assault victims who are the most likely. And that figure, about a third, is exactly the same rate as among adult women who are raped. So it's significantly higher than the average, but it's still not most people who are sexually victimized. Now, I don't know how many of you are really familiar with this because they're getting a little bit in the arcane, but we actually have 3 PTSDs now. And depending where you live, you might get diagnosed with one or the other. So in the US, we operate for psychiatric diagnoses with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual created by the American Psychiatric Association. The rest of the world uses the WHO ICD, International Classification of Diseases. Historically, the PTSDs in each system could be crosswalked and were very similar. That is no longer the case. So we have the US DSM is a big tent PTSD that includes lots of things that aren't specific to the trauma. So they're trauma specific, intrusions, that sort of thing, but they have symptoms that you see in every clinical problem: concentration, sleeping problems, mood problems. The WHO people and the ICT went a completely different direction. And I don't know how the crosswalking is going because it's not too clear exactly how you do that, but they have 2 PTSDs. One PTSD is just plain old regular PTSD. And that, what I like about it, I do prefer the ICD. It's the pure fear-based consequence. So it's vivid, intrusive, very alarming memories, active avoidance, like avoiding reminders, both internal and external, and hypervigilance and exaggerated startle, which are unique. They don't occur in any other diagnosis. Then there's complex PTSD. And it turns out we really needed a different diagnosis for complex PTSD because that is regular PTSD plus 3 other more general consequences. They are extreme emotion dysregulation, serious negative self-identity, and difficulty relating to peers. Now, all of those 3 things you can get there without a trauma and without PTSD. But when they're together, there's an assumption that they're interconnected with each other. So it has been found that in studies in the general population and in clinical studies, kids and adults, you can identify them. There's regular PTSD and there's complex PTSD. And so I think they are on to something. And there is a new theory paper just come out this spring by the top, I'd say, European child and adult people, Phil Hyland, Mark Shevlin, and Chris Bruin. And I like the theory. I think it's really good. It's called memory and identity theory. So that's kind of the lay of our land on psychological impact. So in terms of if someone develops a clinical problem, what should we do? Well, the CBTs that focus on trauma and EMDR are the standard found to work interventions. They're, and it turns out they're effective for both regular PTSD and complex PTSD in the European studies. There's one study that I think is very relevant where it was a study of TFCBT, a very well-known kid CBT for trauma, where they compared the outcomes of regular PTSD kids and complex PTSD kids. Well, the complex PTSD kids started higher and they ended higher, but they benefited equally. So that's really excellent news. We don't need to invent a whole new treatment for kids who have complex PTSD. We just may need to give them something a little bit more, tweak things a little bit to get them the best treatment. And it's probably comparable to anxiety treatment. Kids who have severe cases don't get as much better. But so that leads us to, if a kid has PTSD, they should get the standard treatments, of which there are a fair number of CBTs for trauma out and about. In the US, TFCBT is very widely known and quite widely available, but there are other CBTs, including 2 CBTs that are for trauma that are developmentally down from the adult versions, cognitive processing and prolonged exposure, and other variations. So the one thing I don't think we have any specific studies, maybe somebody knows on online or image-based, that would be different from what we already know works for victimization in general or PTSD. The only thing I can think of, and Steve, I'd be interested in your thoughts about it, which has to do with image-based, because what the main goal of a PTSD treatment is to put the experience in the past as a thing that happened that was bad, but not the defining feature of who I am. It's kind of hard to put it in the past if you haven't the knowledge that images might be floating around out there. I'm in trauma treatment, we're pretty big on facing up, but that's one area which I wonder if it might be better to say, just put it out of your mind. But we don't, who knows on that. So I have just a few final thoughts about trauma-informed treatment principles and approaches. Starting with, we should be supporting natural recovery. We should believe in survivors' ability to cope with and recover and not assume they all have been harmed in a way that requires a formal therapeutic intervention. Brief, because most of them are going to naturally recover. Humans are very resilient, and we should honor that. Brief, psychoeducational, trauma-focused coping skills. Steve, your intervention, I think, is ideal as a first line. Where you can start with this type and see what goes from there. And that is all a lot of people are going to need. Another point I'm really big on is survivors are not going to come in and announce their sexual victimization unless they know somebody has an interest in hearing about it. I believe there should be trauma screening for every kid who is seeking treatment. So we know by definition something is wrong. The kids are suffering. Now that we know that trauma and sexual assault are big factors in the development of all psychological disorders, we should make it a practice to ask. And it turns out patients are fine with it. Kids, adults, there's studies showing they don't mind at all. They're not upset at being asked because they already know what their own experiences are. The only group that is somewhat upset at screening among kids, and we have data on thousands of kids, are those kids who have PTSD. Well, Thank goodness they're upset, because that's the proof they have PTSD, and then we can get them treatment. However, we are in a screening craze in the US at least, and it's led to something that is now, I believe, an iatrogenesis. People are patting themselves on the back because they handed someone a checklist and asked about adversities and traumas, and then they never mention it. And that's not right. If you screen somebody about a bad thing that's happened in their life and they say yes, providers should stop and have a conversation, and that should include validation and acknowledgement and thanking them for sharing. Don't do it if you're not going to talk to the patient. And finally, if they have PTSD, get them to somebody who knows how to treat PTSD, because treating a steady diet of treating trauma survivors and people with PTSD is not for everyone. And victims deserve to be in the room with people who can tolerate hearing every single gory detail if that is what's needed for that person's recovery. And for kids who don't have PTSD, if you know they have a trauma history, they've been exposed to it, you can do a good clinical job just acknowledging, validating, checking to see how it relates to the thing that they are getting treatment for. Because once they've shared it, it's our job to help them put it into perspective. So that's what I have to say about impact and treatment.
Thank you. We do have one question in the chat, which is there any research on mindfulness or mindfulness self-compassion in kids, traumatized kids?
Well, mindfulness is like everywhere, and everyone's doing it. And I don't know if you've seen the recent data, Steve. They teach it to school now to every kid, and the kids don't really love it that much, and they don't practice it. But leaving that aside, there's a mindfulness-based CBT, and that's got some good evidence. There's acceptance and commitment therapy. That's a CBT that uses a sort of acceptance is a mindfulness kind of thing. I think of it as a coping strategy, to be honest. I think that there's no downside to learning to be in the moment and to be grounded, but there are lots and lots of different ways that people can cope, and that's not the only one. And I think we are a little bit too inclined to jump on the latest, oh, this is the one that everybody should do. And I think my own personal strategy, I just ask people, well, what do you do that helps you get through a hard moment? And if they say it's distraction, read a book, play a video game, then I'm going to go with that. I'm not going to say, well, no, that's really no good. What you really need to do is be sitting quietly, listening to your breath. So anyway, I think it's great, but there are a lot of ways that people cope with being stressed out and afraid and everything, all of that. We got to look to the survivors and the patients to tell us what's going to work for them.
Thank you. I completely agree. I will say that the best mindfulness literature is really in mood disorders, and many mood disorders etiologies in childhood, abuse and sexual abuse.
Yeah.
So, I think, there is the what for whom question that we are constantly trying to answer. So I'd love any other thoughts from the panel, or go on, just shout it out.
Okay, since no one's asking questions, I just want to make a comment in response to all the great points you made, Lucy. First of all, thank you for sharing your own personal story and for your courage. Courage is contagious, I find. You made a really good point around the multiple forms of sexual violence against children and adolescents that are out there. And I do want to flag, we've been talking for a while now around sexual violence against children because we want to make sure to cover things like, teenagers who are experiencing rape and other forms of sexual violence that when you talk about child sexual exploitation and abuse, you're not quite getting to. And so thinking about this umbrella term, and I don't know if people have seen, but UNICEF just came out, this is more global, so maybe not, for the first time ever on guidance on terminology around violence against children at large. And they have kind of embraced that. So they actually talk about sexual violence against children. And then underneath that, they have multiple forms. And I think, again, it's been controversial, but that's where UNICEF, for those of us who do work internationally, that's what we're going to look at from now on. WHO has been doing it for a while. And so I think we're starting to get some global alignment around the understanding that for kids and for adolescents, there are all these different types of sexual violence that are floating around. They're oftentimes interconnected.
That's the other point, isn't
And
it?
happening and online, offline is also a dichotomy that for us old people is really relevant, but for the new generations, the data is all telling us not really. And so I think there's an invitation to kind of take a step back and rethink some of these pieces. And so I really appreciate you raising them.
Well, I want to get back at you. Something I want to appreciate that you raised, which I hope you guys, your survivor groups, come up with. I don't know if you've seen Judy Herman's new book, but she wrote Trauma and Recovery, which is a very important book in the area of trauma. But her recent one is something, well, it's over in the corner there and I can't see it. But what she's really talking about is justice. And that we've nailed up pretty much that, the awareness come forward, the treatments we have available, support and validation, but we have not nailed the justice thing one little bit. And it ain't going to be the legal system that gives them that. That is a dead end. That's worth doing if you want to be a good citizen, but you're not going to get a sense of justice from that. And we need alternatives, ways for survivors, and it's going to come from survivors. And so I strongly support and encourage you to do that, because I don't feel what we currently have, the way things are set up, actually affords a sense of justice. And people who have been intentionally harmed want justice. And nobody reports to the police because they want to help an offender. They want something, accountability. And I don't think it's going to come from that. I'm not against it, but it's not enough. So I'm very anxious and interested to learn what your group comes up with.
Steve, I have a quick question and follow up to that. Daniela, in your presentation, you said data is essential, but not sufficient. And it seems to me that one of the great challenges we face, and Carrie Ann talked about prevalence research, and Daniela, the work that you've done with the CDC and others in developing measurement around this, but I still hear from policymakers around the world, if you can't prove it, it must not be a problem. And so I guess my question is, how do we fill that void? How do we raise these issues to the point that policymakers understand it and put it at the top of the policy agenda? And it seems to me that research is central to that.
I agree. And I do think, and I think we all understand, it's yes and, it's not either or.
Yeah.
So the voices and the authentic, representation of what this has done, but we also need to tote up the numbers and the classifying systems. And if people aren't convinced yet, I don't know what is going to convince them. If somebody were to say, well, since everyone doesn't get PTSD, I guess it's no big. I mean, where do you go with that?
Yeah,
So
I think
and
if I
that's
can
the
jump in.
danger.
Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry, Lucy, if I can jump in too. I think partnerships with organizations like Daniela's are really important in this context, because a lot of people who do the research are not great advocates and not great translators of knowledge. So it's something that the modern academic is learning more how to do, and some of the young ones who are coming up after me are getting more skilled at that. But and I don't want to essentialize, but some researchers are just, they might do fabulous research, but they're not great at translating that. They're not great at putting it in words and not good at putting it in the hands of policymakers. So there are, partnerships with organizations like Daniela's are absolutely crucial, but also I think a good example of this is in Penn State. They have liaison officers who are working with academics to connect them up with lawmakers. So those kind of roles are starting to emerge that make the connections better, so that the good research can be put into the hands of those who can make the change and use it, really use it for good.
But one of the reasons I think prevalence data is so important is at the very outset of this, we acknowledge the fact that this is a problem that remains under-recognized, underappreciated, underreported. So filling that gap and helping policymakers understand what the true prevalence of this problem is, I think will be more likely to generate action.
So
Yeah.
Ernie, I think I agree with you. I think the way to get the most effective data is from survivors. To find from survivors who may have all sorts of issues and have never disclosed that these things happen to them.
Yeah.
And I think that is the most effective way. And, for policymakers, it's always about the bottom line. It's the dollar, right? So how is this impacting people's ability to be citizens, to pay taxes, not to cost the system money? That's how you're going to get to them. And the survivors are the best people to tell that story.
Yeah, just to jump in, I think one of the things, I agree with everything that's been said, and absolutely, Ernie. And I think one of the things we underestimate is that advocacy, communications, those are areas of expertise. And a lot of times people are trying to do that, but they don't. Like, what's been exciting for us is really engaging that capability and that expertise. And it's not cheap, let me tell you, to really think about strategy to elevate the issue. And I think policymakers, my experience, again, I was in a position in the US government before where I had a very big budget and I had everyone telling me what I should do with it. And there are three things that really are essential. One is you have to prove to me there's a problem. You need data and evidence. What is the problem? The second is, what are the solutions? And the third is, what is the cost of action and the cost of inaction? The cost of inaction is one that I believe for this issue is zero right now. People don't do anything about it. Who's knocking on their doors? Who's saying we're not going to vote for you because you didn't do this? And I think that's kind of the piece that we're trying to push on, is like to make it not okay to ignore. And then what will be the cost to people? So just some thoughts.
Well, I want to thank our panel and thank our participants. Interesting session. There's so much more to discuss and talk about and think about. I have about 50 questions, but I won't bother anybody with them right now. But thank you all, and let's fight the good fight.
Thank you much. Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you so much to all of our panelists and participants for this fascinating discussion today. I wanted to remind you that in about 27 minutes, we have our final session from today, and that will be the e-safety commissioner from Australia, who will be talking about keeping children safe online, safety by design. And so please stretch your legs, get a drink, and then come back for our final session in just a few minutes. Thanks all.